Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chinese History Podcast. I'm your host, Yiming Ha. Joining me today is Ronald Po, an associate professor in the Department of International History at LIC in the United Kingdom. He is a historian of late imperial China with a focus on maritime history and global studies. His book, titled Blue Frontier: Maritime Vision and Power in the Qing Empire, seeks to revise the view of China in this period as an exclusively continental power with little interest in the sea. Instead, the book argues that Qing deliberately engaged with the ocean politically, militarily, and conceptually, and responded flexibly to challenges and extensive interaction on all frontiers, both land and sea, in the 18th century. Professor Po joins us today to talk about his research on Qing maritime history.
First of all, I just want to thank you, Professor Po, for taking the time to come to the podcast for this interview.
Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here.
So before we get into the specifics of your research, I'm just curious about your own intellectual and academic journey to this topic, because it seems to me that for a long period of time, there wasn't a lot of scholarship on maritime history for the Qing. But in recent years, there's been a lot, and yours is one of the many works on it. So I'm just curious, what led you to this topic? What made you interested in looking into maritime policy and maritime history for the Qing dynasty?
I'm not sure if it is entirely relevant, but I was born and raised in Hong Kong, so that I was always surrounded by water as a kid. And I also loved swimming, which made me feel close to the ocean, I would say. And I also enjoyed activities like ferry crossing and so forth. You know that there's a Victoria Harbour in Hong Kong, so there are ferry crossings every day. However, back then, I never imagined that I would one day work on maritime history. But what I can say is that I've been interested in the sea and Chinese history since I was young. But my gateway to maritime history opened only when I was about to apply for a scholarship to study in Germany. And that scholarship was about the history of the Asian seas, which is fascinating. And I found the descriptions of that scholarship particularly intriguing too. And so I decided to dive deeper into the field of maritime history. But to be perfectly honest, I only know very little about the field of maritime history before diving deeper into this fascinating scholarly field. I still remember that I thought that maritime history was a discipline to only study the marine creatures, like such as the history of dolphins, the history of whales, and so forth. But of course, these are also topics in the field that have been studied by historians. But what I want to say is that the scope of maritime history was much wider than I initially expected when I went through those readings. And going back to my journey, because I had to apply for that scholarships, that's why I spent close to a year reading books, articles related to maritime history when I was working as a research assistant at Hong Kong Baptist University. But speaking of which, I have to thank Professor Clara Ho and Professor Ricardo Mack from the Department of History at Baptist U for providing me with that invaluable platform, getting myself ready to study abroad and to apply for that scholarship. But anyway, so the more I read, the more excited I become about working on maritime history. And these readings been also somehow propelled me to think more about the connections between China and the sea. And as we all know that, like China was traditionally being labeled as an agrarian society, a land power, a continental empire, or if we quote the Polish historians, Witold Rosinski, a walled kingdom. Of course, we are familiar with those like maritime Silk Road, all sorts of navigation technology developed in the Song era, as well as the very famous Zhang He expeditions during the Ming Dynasty. But the linkage between China and the sea in general is fairly weak, as you just mentioned. We don't really have that much of scholarship about maritime history in the past. And especially when we try to focus on the late imperial era, we can say that apart from the 7 voyages led by Zhang He, and the other events used to refer to would be the Qing conquest of Taiwan in 1683 And then the First Opium War, followed by a series of defeats in the sea of the Qing Empire. And I could also recall that when I was a student in Hong Kong studying in secondary school, my history teacher has been posed a question for us, in which I also mentioned in my Blue Frontier. Why was the Qing Empire defeated by the Japanese in the First Sino-Japanese War? And one of the so-called model answers is that China was a continental power and not a maritime power. So therefore, it did not really care about the sea. And that's it. And I would say, in fact, some historians these days would still argue that the Qing ignored the sea for a very long time because by default, it was a land power. By default, it was an agricultural-based society. So that the Western powers in the 19th century, they could take advantage of it by invading China from the sea. But anyway, I was already suspicious about the so-called model answers provided by my secondary school teacher back then. But the readings about maritime history that I came across when preparing for that PhD scholarship applications reminded me of the same questions and discussions. And for example, can we simply make use of all those 19th century sea battles and humiliating experience in the sea, to explain the maritime history of the Qing Empire in the long 18th century? Or if we agree that the Qing Empire was a shining power in the early modern era, did it really completely ignore its maritime frontier? So I think the connections between China and the sea should be tighter. And given the fact that obviously the Qing was not a landlocked empire, but an Asian giant, that had a coastline of more than 1,400 kilometers. So we should have more to talk about. And in addition to the conquest of Taiwan and the many Sino-foreign conflicts that happened in the sea. So yeah, so this is the story that I became interested in the maritime history of the Qing. Sorry that my answer was a bit too long.
No, it's
But I think
it's very interesting. It's always fascinating to hear professors or scholars talk about how they become interested and passionate about a topic.
yeah,
This is
yeah,
slightly
I
off
think you
topic.
framed it. Yeah,
No, sorry.
sorry, after you.
Oh no, sorry.
No, I just want to say you framed the question very well, so which allows me to tie everything together from when I was young.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just gonna say this is slightly off topic, but I was teaching a maritime history course, East Asia maritime history course last quarter, and then I had a student in my class who was from Hong Kong. He told me that there's actually a maritime history museum in Hong Kong. I don't know if you know it or been there.
There is actually in Hong Kong, there are lots of stuff related to maritime histories. In addition to the Maritime Museum in Hong Kong, there are lots of, for example, temples along the coast, which has a very close connections with maritime religions, with seafaring activities, and so forth. And Hong Kong was also one of the bases of the famous pirates, Zhang Baozhai, who actually lived in Hong Kong for a while. And there was a Zhang Baozhai cave, Zhang Baozhai Dong, in Long Island. It's called Changzhou in Hong Kong. So these are all the historical sites related to maritime history that is worth mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent 2 years in Hong Kong for my MPhil, so I haven't been to the Maritime History Museum, but I did see some of the maritime sites. Yeah.
Yeah, I should. One day you should go visit them.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to your research because you have brought up some very interesting points and important points. As you said, the conventional view has always been that the Qing is a continental empire, landlocked, agrarian polity that neglected its navy and maritime frontier. But your book and your research has really challenged this view by arguing that the Qing engaged extensively with its maritime world. So can you just talk a little bit about how it engaged with the maritime sphere? What were the policies that it implemented from, say, the late 17th century after it conquered Taiwan throughout the 18th century leading up to the First Opium War?
Yeah, of course, sure. But I have to say that you're very kind, Yiming, because what I want to say is I'm not the first one to argue that like the connections between Qing and the maritime world should be tighter than we commonly assume. There were scholars from both China and the West who already suggested that late imperial China could be situated and should be situated in a maritime context before I publish my book. So I would like to really take this opportunity to actually thank all the scholarly efforts that makes the field intellectually exciting, really. For example, the Canton system in the 18th century has been studied extensively by Paul van Dyck, Gang Zhao, and of course John Wills and so forth, and also the connections bridging China and those overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia were examined in detail by Wang Gengwu, Anthony Weed, and Leona Blusset, and even the tension between the states and pirates. We just briefly mentioned pirates earlier. These sort of tensions was also researched by Diane Murray and Robert Anthony in the 1990s, if not earlier. So what I did, I think, is to perhaps add some sort of conceptual layers on top of all these fascinating studies, and to perhaps bring some of these insights together more effectively. I also tried to make use of some additional materials concerning maritime histories, such as sea charts, to further enhance our understanding of the Qing as well as its relations with the maritime world. So anyway, so going back to your questions, I think the Qing maritime policies in the long 18th century, in my view, is quite practical and flexible. And it could be viewed at least from two perspectives. One is the development of its navy, and the other is the institutionalizations of regulating and fostering both domestic and foreign sea trade. Let me first talk about the development of its navy. Speaking of the development of a navy, it's not only about building vessels and then to police the sea, and that's all. No, it's more than that, because by developing a navy, it covers a wide range of stuffs. For example, the selections of proper timber to build the ships, and also to repair and to maintain the ships, and the recruitment of soldiers to fight on board. The training involved to maintain the capability of the navy, the survey of the coastline, the proper governance of some of the offshore islands, as well as an effective divisions of the sea to maintain substantial control, and not to mention the strategies to fight against the pirates. So there are more stuff than just simply building a wooden ships in the 18th century. So therefore, if we try to look at the effort that the Qing court had invested in these naval development, we can see that they did not ignore the maritime frontiers. Actually, they were actually quite proactive in investing in the maritime frontiers. I would also say that it's very hard for them to ignore the maritime frontier, because we should never forget that since the Kangxi era, after Taiwan was annexed, the central government already set up policies to revive the coastal economy, because we know that during that period of time, the coast was blocked because of the Zhang's family. I know that you also got a podcast with Xin Hang to talk
Yeah.
about the Zhang's. Yeah, that was fascinating. I enjoyed it. So we know that the sea blockade policy, but after Taiwan was annexed, the Kangxi Emperor decided to reopen the sea. And so he also had to set up policies to rebuild the coastal economy. So one way of achieving it, according to him, is to make sure that both domestic and foreign sea trade could operate peacefully in the sea. So as a result, we can see that there was an interrelationships between the stability of the maritime frontier and the economic activities across the board. So that's why it makes perfect sense for the Qing Empire to invest in the maritime frontiers by setting up its naval policies or naval development. So that's the perspective of naval development. Regarding this second perspective that I mentioned earlier, that is the institutionalizations of regulating and fostering sea trade, I would say that the Qing court was a significant imperial power that organized, streamlined it, and restructured the custom office after the annexation of Taiwan in 1683. It's because we always have long been focusing on that year, saying that, oh, Taiwan was conquered and then it became part of the Qing Empire. But what we shouldn't overlook is that actually, right after 1683, the Qing Empire already established 4 custom offices along the coast of southern China. And quoting Gang Zhao, because of these establishments of custom offices, the Qing set up the most open sea trade policy in the long 18th century. And actually, this is a very interesting angle to look at, as according to Gang Zhao, the Qing actually set up the most open sea trade policy. And I would recommend our listeners to find out more details in Zhao Gang's work. But what I would like to add is that I agree with what Gang Zhao has argued, and we should also bear in mind that Taiwan was conquered by the Manchus. After Taiwan was conquered by the Manchus, it does not mean that the sea is now pacified, so that there was nothing to worry about from Qing court perspective. On the contrary, that year, right after the annexation of Taiwan, as I mentioned earlier, the Kangxi government immediately established 4 custom offices in southern China to foster sea trade. So in other words, the Qing was already engaged with both short distance and long distance sea trade before the middle of the 18th century, or to be more specific, the year 1757, when the Canton system was formalized. In fact, speaking of the Canton system, it was a system derived from the practice of the custom offices launched it in the late 17th century. So that's why I suggested that there was a continuations concerning the Qing engagement with maritime trade between the Kangxi era and the late Qianlong era. So it wasn't simply because the Western traders, particularly the British, that prompted the Qing to so-called open the sea in the late 18th century or the early 19th century. It was not as simple as that. And so I think that continuations from the Kangxi era all the way to the late Qianlong court. Once this continuation clarified, and then we can then try to discuss whether or not the Qing was driving the early wave of globalizations, as well as some other intellectual discourses. So that's how I would summarize the Qing's engagement with the maritime world in the long 18th century.
That's absolutely fascinating. But one thing that I was interested in is you mentioned in the development of a navy and naval policy that the issue of piracy was of concern to the court. And we know that in the Ming, you had the so-called Wokou or Japanese pirates who were really Chinese people from the coast who were engaged in smuggling because there was a maritime ban. That maritime ban launched a huge wave of piracy. And then after that, with the arrival of the Europeans, there was another wave of piracy in the late Ming, pillaging ships. So we know that those were the causes of piracy in the Ming. But for the Qing, given that the Kangxi Emperor and Yongzheng and Qianlong had this more open policy towards maritime trade, why was there still piracy in the Qing? And what were these pirates doing? Were they raiding settlements, raiding ships, or were they also smuggling?
I would say there were always pirates. Whether or not it's like the sea is peaceful or seemingly risk-free, pirates were always there. In other words, even during peacetime or even during trouble times, you can't really get rid of these group of people. But of course, even as you mentioned earlier, even during the sea blockade era, although the sea was officially blocked, but there was still illegal sea trade. There was still illegal like seafaring activities that we could find along the coast of China. The reason for that is simple. Even during that sea blockade policy, for the coastal communities in China, they have to live with the sea. They have to survive. Because we are always, again, we're always under the impression that China was an agricultural-based society, isn't it? But it wasn't entirely correct, because some of these maritime provinces, they did not only rely on agricultural productions. They have to, for example, Fujian particularly, they have to live with the sea. So that's why, even during very difficult times, they have to find ways to survive by engaging with piracy. So your question is like, how come there's still piracy? I would say, like, during troubled times, you could of course see that piracy is something that the empire couldn't avoid. And during peacetime, because some of these sea lanes were also profitable for some pirates to raid, although some of these pirates would not raid towns or coastal villages like the era during those troubling times, they would also like attack merchant ships. And the merchant ships that they attack, they might not be like large merchant ships. They could be medium-sized or small-sized merchant ships that just simply carry some daily stuff. like rice, vegetables, salt, and all this kind of like daily stuff that in which they could easily find a market to sell all these booties and then cash in something immediately. So these type of activities as what we would try to label them as petty pirates. So during the long 18th century, although at the end of the 18th century, there was, maybe we can talk about it more later, there was a group of some powerful pirates emerge from the scene because there began to have a disengagement between the Qing court and the maritime governance towards the end of the 18th century. But before that, I would say in the middle and in the early 18th century, petty pirates could easily be found. And it was one sort of crime in the maritime world that we could easily spot it in governmental papers and so forth. So although the Qing court developed or invests in policing, defending the maritime frontiers, some of these piratical activities was always there. And it was one of the chronic problems, I would say, that the Qing court had to pay attention to.
Yeah, it just seemed to me that as you get to the later part of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, these pirate bands become really massive, thousands of ships and tens of thousands of people. So did the Qing Navy have naval engagements with them? Or was there other ways that the Qing court engaged with these pirate groups?
The Qing, I would say for those petty pirates, the Qing would never negotiate with them. Once those petty pirates were caught by the local governors, by the navies, most of them were sentenced to death. Some of them were being like punished, of course. I mean, the punishment, I mean, harsh punishments, I mean, towards those petty pirates. But for those powerful pirates, like those the one led by Zhang Yisao, Zhang Baozai, and Cai Qian in the late 18th century, the Qing court actually did try to negotiate with them. The Qing government wanted to pacify them by recruiting them to join the government because they realized they were too powerful to just simply keep fighting against each other. So there are two, I would say there are two ways of handling the problem of piracy from the Qing court in the long 18th century, which is fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the whole issue of piracy in and of itself could be the subject of an entire interview. But I do want to talk a little bit about the Canton system because you brought it up in your answer. And the Canton system is pretty famous when we talk about Qing history, Qing maritime history. And it's often been criticized as this mechanism that limits trade. It's a sign of the Qing's isolationism and refusal to engage with the world. And it started the Opium War. And this is kind of stuff that we've read a lot about. But in your book, you came out against this argument and challenged this view of the Canton system. So can you explain a little bit more about the role of Canton or Guangzhou in the Qing maritime sphere? And what exactly is the function of the Canton system in Qing maritime policy?
Yeah, sure. But I have to reiterate that I'm not the first to challenge the conception that the Canton system should not be criticized for limiting trade. What I did is to streamline what have been examined in the past and to conceptualize some of the aspects of the Canton system. And I would really encourage our listeners to study the works by Leonard Blasey, Paul van Dyck, Angela Stockenhammer, John Wong, Gang Zhao, and Chen Guodong in Taiwan. But I can still talk about the Canton system and remind everybody that the Canton system is, first of all, derived from the practice of the custom officers that was established in the late 17th century, as I mentioned earlier, after Taiwan was annexed and then Qing Empire established the four custom officers in southern China. So because of that, and then it represented a continuation of the Qing's engagement with domestic and foreign sea trade. So that's the first point of reminder. And secondly, the Canton system is not simply because the Qing wanted to limit its trade with foreigners. Actually, it is also because foreign traders prefer conducting sea trade in Canton due to several reasons. For example, like Canton or Guangzhou is geographically located closer to Southeast Asia, where most of the Asian bases of those foreign traders were located. And Canton could also benefit, I mean, from the wind directions, because we know that in the age of sail, the directions of wind, these kind of trading winds, I mean, matters a lot. So Canton benefits a lot from these climatic factors. And the other thing is that like Canton has the apparatus to facilitating sea trade with foreign merchants. The city itself did not only have the hardwares like the 13 factories, I'm sure we've heard of it, that's the hardware of it, but also the software, meaning the interpreters, the people who were experienced accommodating and communicating with foreigners and so forth. So Canton seems like a perfect place, I mean, for both the Chinese and the foreigners, I mean, to work together. And let me give you a very interesting examples because I remember reading an imperial edicts that in fact the emperor, the Qianlong emperor was saying, oh, the foreign traders could also trade in Ningbo or somewhere in that area, because if they really want to, we can maybe try to make some plans for them. But the Ningbo officials, they actually were so against such ideas, saying that, oh, we couldn't do it because we don't know how to deal with these foreign traders. I mean, they better stay in Canton because we don't have these expertise, we don't have the interpreters, we don't have the softwares, in quotes, right, softwares, to handle these foreign traders. So the dynamics actually within China itself was also very interesting. And of course, the traders, the 13 factory traders, and the official in Canton would also love to keep this kind of monopoly because it's a lucrative business to conduct these kind of like trading activities with the merchants from the West. So they could generate a huge profit. It would make them a fortune. So that's why they were all also quite protective in safeguarding such a monopoly. So when we look at the Canton system, we all have to take into consideration all of these factors and dynamics within China itself. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the Westerners were also very supportive doing business in Canton. And don't forget, if they have to sell up north, I mean, before the Macarthur missions, before the late 18th century, if they have to sell up north, I mean, they have to make sure that there were enough profit for them that could compensate that journey. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother to sail further north. So this is also some other dynamics, I mean, related to the Canton system that is, I think, in my assessment, is worth discussing. And finally, I think the Canton system should not be regarded as a sign of the Qing isolationism, as you just framed it as keywords beautifully in your questions. And in fact, I think we have long been under the impression that the Canton system was one of the reasons that triggered the Macarthur missions. I'm sure we all heard of it, and then the First Opium War. This is not entirely correct in my view, because the Macarthur missions happened in 1793, while the Canton system was first initiated in 1757. And according to some historians, such as John Carroll, actually between 1757 and 1793, that we were talking about 36 years. And during that 36 years, we did not see too many disturbance or conflicts between the British and the Qing reported to both parties. So what does that mean? It means that the system had been operating fairly well. And as Zhao Gang also mentioned in his book, the EIC traders, East Indian Company traders, the British East Indian Company traders, were treated sensibly by the Qing court. And the support they received from China was quite fair. Yeah, so it was because there was a decline in profit for the EIC traders due to a variety of extra fees imposed by those 13 factories in the late 18th century, and then which led them to criticize the Canton system. But we should be reminded that these issues, these complaints, I mean, mainly surfaced in the years leading up to the Macarthur mission that was in 1793. And regarding the Macarthur missions, like scholars such as Enter Harrison and Antonio Andrade have recently published fantastic studies advocating for a revisionist approach to look at the mission, in which I won't get into the weed on that right now. But what I really want to highlight is that the Canton system wasn't all that flawed or full of loopholes. In fact, it worked quite well for a good stretch of time. So we shouldn't really just always treat it as a symbol of isolation or a symbol of China distancing itself from the maritime world or from the global market. It wasn't always the case.
Yeah, and it seems that the biggest opponents of the Canton system were from the British, right? They're the ones who complained the most. And as you said, various reasons led to the McCartney missions that wanted to open more ports for British trade. I was just wondering, do you know if any other Europeans were criticizing the Canton system, or was it just the British who had problems with it?
I think mainly according to the historical records, the British, were those who were aggressive enough to challenge the Canton system, and which is sensible because they were I would say they really benefit a lot from the Canton system, and the EIC expanded quite dramatically in East Asia and Asia as a whole. Yeah, I think there were also some led to conflicts between some other foreign traders and the Qing regarding the Canton system, particularly during the late 18th century, as I mentioned earlier, that because the 13 factories, they didn't just simply target the British by imposing some extra fees on them, because these new fees also applied to other foreign merchants. But it was the British who who were bold enough to negotiate with the Qing in that manner, and that's why we do have the Macan missions. But of course, there were other traders, also tried to negotiate with the Qing, like Tony Andrade. And he just recently published a book, I'm sure you have heard of it, The Last Embassy, which is that mission after the Macan missions that the Dutch East India Company sent some envoys into the Qing and then to talk about some new terms. And although at that time the VOC were already in decline, but still they were making profits in East Asia. And so what I want to say is that the interactions between the Qing and the Western world should not be simply confined between the Qing and the British. You're right, there were other European traders who might experience that sort of difficulties in the Canton system towards the end of the 18th century. But the British obviously were the most aggressive ones, I would say.
Yeah. Since we're on the topic of the British, obviously the Opium War is the next step after the McCartney missions. I think there was another one, right? The Amherst mission. And then several decades after that, the Opium War breaks out. But given that the traditional view was always that the Qing just didn't know how to fight a naval battle. And so they were easily defeated by the British. And I know the Industrial Revolution starts kicking off. So the technology also plays a role. But given that we know now the Qing had engaged extensively with the maritime realm and they had a navy and a naval policy, why was it ultimately defeated by the British in the First Opium War?
Yeah, I like these questions. And this is also the questions I ask all the time. So to answer these questions, I think, first of all, we have to understand that the outbreak of the First Opium War was in 1839, so that we should be careful by not simply using the outcome of this battle to explain everything related to Qing engagement with the maritime world in the long 18th century. But at the same time, there's no doubt that the Qing failed to maintain its navy properly towards the end of the 18th century for some reasons that I already hinted in my earlier responses to your questions. But just to sum up, like that, for example, there were problems of corruptions, nepotisms, and also the lack of substantial funding to keep the navy in good shape, especially when they tried to encounter with the pirates. And because don't forget that by sustaining a navy, it's not a cheap endeavor. It is quite costly. It's quite costly. And the Qing, even for example, they have set up regulations to check on the ship every 3 years, and then to repair a war vessels every 5 years, and also to replace the old war junks with a new one every 10 years. And they all cost the Qing money to do it. And the Qing did not always, have enough resources to sustain this particularly enterprising projects. So, especially towards the end of the 18th century, there was always a lack of substantial fundings coming from the coastal governors that asking money from Beijing to say that we need to have more resources to sustain our navy, not just the navy, but also the coastal fortifications. But the Qing court, they didn't just really have enough to sustain everything. And in addition, there were also internal rebellions and other domestic crises that forbade the Qing court to further develop its navy. And as I mentioned, even its coastal fortifications. And that's also something worth mentioning, apart from the lack of fundings and corruptions and these kind of internal problems. There's also a problem caused by a long period of peace, which led to a kind of inertia among the soldiers on board. Well, this long period of peace, I think this is the concept itself was first introduced by Frederick Wakeman. You must be very familiar with his work. And then elaborated by Peter Perdue to explain the decay of land military forces. It was also adapted by, again, Tony Andrade, who developed its great military divergence theories, which is exciting. But anyway, I think the long peace issues could also apply in the maritime context. I mean, not just in the continental context, because the Navy found itself trapped in this prolonged state of relative peace as well. But of course, this period of peace, long period of peace, doesn't mean that there was no crime or piracy at sea at all, as we already discussed. Where piracy is something that you can't really get rid of. They were always there, even during peacetime or whatever. And as I argue in The Blue Frontier, my book, the period of peace only means that the sea bordering China were relatively quieter compared to many other blue frontiers adjacent to European countries. So as a result, when the Qing faced a significant, more powerful seafaring nations such as Great Britain, it shouldn't be too surprising to see them defeated because of all these sorts of like problems within the empire in the early 19th centuries. So, in other words, returning to the issues of the inertia from the long peace, the Qing was, in a sense, victims of its own success during the seemingly prosperous long 18th century. And this, I would also suggest that it was one of the reasons that could explain the downwards of the development of the navies in the end of the 18th century, and then the early 19th century, and then the defeat during the First Opium War.
I guess there's a lot of different factors that we have to consider when we talk about China's defeat in the First Opium War. But just for the benefit of our listeners who might not be familiar with this period of history, what happened to the Qing maritime policy, the institutionalization you talked about with the customs houses and the canton system after the Opium War ended? Was there a substantial change in how the Qing approached foreign trade after that?
Yes, there is substantial changes after the First Opium War, and particularly after the Second Opium War, I would say, when the Treaty of Tianjin was signed in 1860. Yes, because after that, because we have been talking about the custom office, but after the two opium wars, there was no longer custom officers because the Western powers realized that the only way that they could obtain benefits or profits from the Qing would be to make sure that they have a proper custom system. So that's why they not encourage the Qing, but they forced them to develop a new custom system, which is called custom service. So that custom service is very different from the custom offices that we just mentioned, because the custom services was the very first institution in Chinese history that was operated and run by foreigners. But of course, these foreigners, they were still employed by the Qing, but the reason why the custom services was established is because the foreign traders and foreign powers did not believe in the way that the Chinese or the Manchus operated the system anymore. So they demanded a more reliable and effective system in which they could also benefit from all kinds of seafaring activity and trade. And of course, the most important figure in running this custom service would be Robert Hart, who was Irish and actually operating the custom service system very well and sponsored because of the custom service that he operated. Then China was able to launch various kinds of modernization projects in the late 19th century. So the custom service then became more than just a window or a checkpoint or a unit that operated seafaring activities. It also, later in the 19th century, the customs service also became a significant party that funded most of the self-strengthening projects and funded most of these kind of like modernization projects in late imperial China. So yeah, that's how the story developed and emerged.
I see. So before we conclude the interview, I just want to ask you, as a final concluding question, some of your thoughts about the broader significance of understanding maritime history. How does a better understanding of Qing maritime history alter or better inform how we see the Qing or China?
Mm, okay, yeah. So the first question is about the significance of understanding maritime history, isn't it? To me, I think maritime history is more than the history of various kinds of marine creatures. As I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversations, it's not just about the dolphins, the octopus, or the whales. It covers a lot of fascinating issues that could provide insights into how human societies have interacted with each other as well as with the ocean itself. So through maritime histories, I think we can study economic developments across countries, the cultural exchanges across people, as well as the military and political history between powers over territories and resources. And we can also make use of maritime history to understand the human impact on marine environment. I think environmental histories has begun to obtain global prominence in the past 2 decades. And I believe that the sea should also be included in the discussion or the so-called environmental historical turn. For example, like topics such as the exploitations of maritime resources, alterations of coastline, and the pollutions of the sea and waterways, even during the Qing era, could tell us more about the ecological costs of human economic and industrial activities. So all of these topics and directions, I mean, could help us better comprehend the past of China and also the past of human civilizations, I would say. And then circling back to your second questions is about the Qing maritime history, I believe we can obtain a more thorough picture of the history of the Qing Empire by studying Qing maritime history. At least we should better orientate or situate the so-called agricultural-based China within a maritime context. Because I also want to take this opportunity to reiterate that, I mean, my work, I didn't want to argue that the Qing was the sea power. My ultimate concern is that how shall we study a continental power like the Qing when they have to engage with the ocean? So in Chinese, it's, I mean, how to study the Qing when it comes to their 筹海 policy. 筹海 is like, to manage sea and to also examine his maritime consciousness that developed in the Qing, I mean, through various kinds of maritime engagements and interactions. And because I always feel like that while we have been talking about the Qing and the sea, it might give our listeners or readers I mean, oh, the Qing was then a sea power. So that is something that I'm not arguing because, as I said, is as a land power, as an agricultural-based society with a coastline that is more than 1,400 kilometers, it also makes perfect sense for them to interact with the oceans. And there must be a way that they developed on their own terms when it comes to these maritime matters. So this is something that I would like to emphasize on. And yeah, I would also like to take the opportunity to point out that while we have been discussing the Qing and the sea as a specific space, either serving as the corridor linking the Qing with the world or a protective belt to guard the coastal community against the pirates and potential invaders from the maritime domains. But if we try to view the sea as a frontier in a more academic and dialectical manner, it opens up possibilities for comparisons with the inland frontier. And this approach has already inspired scholars in Taiwan, Kong Lingwei from Academia Sinica and Lu Zhengheng from Yangming Jiaotong University, also in Taiwan, to embark on an exciting project that connects the sea and the inland frontier under the broader themes of imperial frontier management and governance. I myself also explored the concepts of inner-outer governance between inland and maritime frontiers, but I think there's definitely rooms for further development. And so this is what I would like to put forward, that this perspective, and particularly the projects led by Dr. Ko and Dr. Liu in Taiwan, is truly phenomenal because it could enhance our insight into the Qing, the sea, and its frontier, both on land and at sea, and thereby revising our perspectives on the imperial history of China. That is something that I would say maritime histories matters and is quite rewarding.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think it's very exciting, the new research that has been coming out in recent years on maritime history, not just in the Qing, I would say, but also in the Ming and even the Yuan, right? That's just another empire that we tend to assume it's a continental empire just by the scale of its conquest. But there's just been research coming out in recent years about how the Mongols are also engaging with the sea. So it's all very fascinating. And it's an exciting,
Indeed,
I think,
indeed.
period of time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the Yuan and the Qing dynasties should also be compared in multiple respects. I'm not a Yuan historian, so I couldn't really say too much about it. But yeah, given their engagement with the sea as a sort of like nomadic empires, more exiles in riding horses, I mean, and so forth, the engagement with the maritime world is truly worth comparing.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I certainly look forward to the new research and also your new research in the future. But I think we are at time. So I just want to thank you again, Professor Po, for coming to the podcast and sharing your wonderful insight and research on Qing maritime history.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine.
All right, great. This concludes our interview. So thank you for listening to the Chinese History Podcast.